I remember that day as if it were yesterday. My hands trembled slightly on the polished wooden cane I leaned upon, the sound of its tip echoing faintly against the marble floor of the lawyer's office. The room was filled with my family, blood, my children, the people I had sacrificed everything for. They were seated in neat rows, their bodies stiff, their faces already carrying a strange mix of expectation and greed. The atmosphere was heavy, suffocating almost, as if the very walls could sense what was about to unfold. The lawyer, a serious man with silver hair and sharp glasses, adjusted his papers with deliberate slowness, stretching out every second like a taut string. The ticking of the clock on the wall was louder than it had any right to be. I felt their eyes on me, cold, sharp, impatient. My eldest son, Robert, sat with his wife, clinging tightly to his arm. Her smile wasn't a smile at all. It was the thin-lipped expression of someone waiting to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. Beside them, my daughter, Margaret, fiddled with her phone, hardly glancing up. My youngest, Daniel, avoided my gaze entirely, staring instead at the polished shoes on his feet. They had all gathered not out of love or respect, but because they knew the reading of a will meant one thing: inheritance. I wish I could tell you that day was filled with warmth, that they embraced me, that they asked how I was holding up after the long months of illness and solitude. But no, there was no tenderness in their eyes, only calculation. When the lawyer finally cleared his throat and began, you could almost hear the collective inhale of anticipation. "This is the last will and testament of Mr. James Whitmore," he began, his voice steady and professional. At the mention of my name, a strange shiver went down my spine. It is an odd thing to hear your own life reduced to papers, 2 lines of text written in legal jargon. As he read the preamble, my mind wandered for a moment. I looked around the room and thought about the years I had poured into these people's birthdays I never missed, the nights I worked 2 jobs to pay for their schooling, the countless sacrifices I made to ensure they would never know the kind of hunger I had endured in my own childhood. Every wrinkle on my face, every ache in my bones, was etched there by years of labor done for their benefit. And yet, sitting there in that office, surrounded by my flesh and blood, I had never felt more like a stranger. Then came the words that sliced through the silence like a blade. "To my children, Robert, Margaret, and Daniel, I leave nothing. Nothing." The room exploded with gasps, sharp intakes of breath, and a sudden, disbelieving silence that followed, like the stillness after a storm. I saw their eyes widen, their mouths open, as though they had misheard. My eldest son's face turned red almost instantly, his jaw clenching. Margaret dropped her phone, the clatter loud against the hardwood floor. Daniel just sat frozen, his mouth slightly ajar, as if he couldn't comprehend the words. Their outrage filled the room. "What do you mean, nothing?" Robert barked, his voice rising, echoing off the walls. "This must be some kind of mistake." Margaret, trembling with fury, turned her gaze to me, her eyes burning holes through my chest. "Father, how could you do this to us? After everything, after we—" She stopped, but the irony of her words nearly made me laugh. "After they what? After they abandoned me in my old age, after they treated me like an unwanted burden in their homes." The lawyer, unfazed by the chaos, continued reading. His voice carried on above their protests, calm, deliberate, unwavering. He read the lines I had written with careful thought, with trembling hands but a firm heart. "Instead, I leave my estate, including my home, my savings, and all my worldly possessions, to a person who showed me kindness when my own children turned away from me. To Mrs. Evelyn Carter, my neighbor and friend, who treated me with respect and dignity when my family no longer did." The eruption that followed could have shaken the very building. My children's voices overlapped in a storm of disbelief and rage. Robert slammed his fist against the table. Margaret was crying now, though I could not tell if they were tears of grief or sheer frustration at losing what she believed was hers. Daniel finally found his voice, muttering over and over, "This isn't fair. This isn't fair. Fair." The word echoed in my mind, Was it fair that I spent decades working myself to the bone so they could live comfortably, only to be cast aside like a worn-out shoe? Was it fair that, in my old age, I was left to eat meals alone, to shuffle through empty rooms, to hear my phone ring only when they needed money? No, my children. Life had not been fair to me. But this was my justice. I looked at them then, really looked at them, at the lines of greed carved into Robert's face, at the bitterness twisted into Margaret's expression, at the emptiness in Daniel's eyes. I felt a strange calm wash over me. For years, I had begged for their love, clung to the hope that someday they would see me, not as a burden, but as a father worthy of affection. That hope had died long ago. What remained was a quiet resolve. They shouted, they argued, they accused, but I remained silent, sitting there with my cane in hand, watching the storm I had unleashed. And amidst their chaos, I remembered Evelyn, the kind widow who lived next door, the woman who brought me soup when I was sick, who sat with me on lonely evenings, who listened to my stories without rolling her eyes or checking her watch. She was not my blood, but she had given me more warmth and respect in a few short years than my own children had in decades. She had shown me that kindness does not always wear the face of family. That day, in that office, as my children seethed with anger and disbelief, I realized something profound. Love is not owed simply because of blood. It is earned through compassion, respect, and care. The will had been read. The truth was laid bare. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. But of course, that was not the end. The will was only the spark that lit the fire. The days that followed were filled with confrontation, betrayal, and revelations I never expected. My family thought they could intimidate me, manipulate me, even shame me into reversing my decision. They didn't know that I had already reached a point of no return. What happened in that room was just the beginning. And that is where my story truly begins. After that storm in the lawyer's office, after the gasps and accusations, I knew people would judge me harshly. They would whisper in corners about the cruel old man who disinherited his children. They would wonder what kind of father could do such a thing. That is why I need to tell you my story, not to justify myself, but to show you the life that led me to that decision. I was not born into wealth. No, far from it. I came into this world in a cramped, drafty cottage on the outskirts of a coal mining town in Yorkshire. My father was a miner, his hands permanently blackened, his lungs scarred from years underground. My mother kept the home together with little more than determination and scraps of fabric she stitched into clothes. We had more love than money, but love does not fill a hungry stomach. I learned the value of hard work before I could even spell the word. At 9 years old, I was delivering newspapers in the biting winter wind, my fingers so numb I could hardly fold the pages. By 12, I was stacking crates at the local grocer, earning pennies that went straight into the household jar. I never kept a coin for myself. Everything belonged to the family. Back then, that was simply the way of things. School was a luxury, and though I attended when I could, my education was more often interrupted by the call of work. Still, I was a bright lad, curious about the world. I would borrow worn-out books from the library, reading them by candlelight, long after my parents had gone to bed. History, poetry, geography, devoured anything I could find. Knowledge became my secret rebellion against poverty. Then came the war. I was barely 17 when Britain called on its young men. I lied about my age to enlist, eager to prove myself, to escape the confines of our small town. Those years left scars. I rarely speak of friends buried in foreign soil, nights filled with the echo of artillery. But they also taught me resilience, discipline, and above all, the fragility of life. When I returned, I vowed I would build something lasting, something my children would never have to sacrifice for the way I did. It was after the war that I met her Elizabeth. She had auburn hair that caught the sunlight like fire, and eyes that held a kindness I had never known. She worked as a nurse, tending to the wounded, carrying the weight of other people's pain with quiet grace. From the moment we met, I knew she was the anchor my restless soul had been searching for. We married in a modest church with barely enough money for a reception. But we had each other, and that felt like wealth beyond measure. Together, we dreamed of a future brighter than our pasts. Those early years were not easy. We lived in a small rented flat, its walls thin and its pipes noisy. I worked as a mechanic by day and took shifts as a night watchman by night. Elizabeth continued her nursing, often returning home with exhaustion etched into her face. But we were happy. We shared laughter over cups of weak tea, held hands while walking through markets we could barely afford, whispered promises to each other in the quiet dark. When our first child, Robert, was born, my world shifted. I held him in my arms, so small, so fragile, and I swore a silent oath he would never know the hunger I had known, the fear of wondering if tomorrow would bring bread or emptiness. Margaret came 2 years later, her cries sharp and insistent, demanding the world's attention. Then, years later, Daniel, my quiet boy, whose eyes seemed always lost in dreams. I poured everything into them. Every pound I earned, every hour I worked, was for my children. I wore shoes with holes, so theirs would be new. I turned down promotions that required travel because I wanted to be present at their school plays, their football matches, their birthdays. Elizabeth often reminded me to think of myself, to rest, to allow a little joy. But my joy was in them. Watching their faces light up on Christmas morning when they unwrapped the toys I had saved all year to buy, that was my reward. Seeing Robert walk across the stage at university, Margaret winning a writing competition, Daniel building his first model airplane, those were my treasures. Yet, as the years rolled on, something began to shift. Perhaps it was subtle at first, but I noticed it. My children grew, as all children do. They developed opinions, desires, ambitions. That was natural. What hurt was not their independence, but the gradual distance that followed. As teenagers, they rolled their eyes at my stories of hard work and sacrifice. They called me old-fashioned, mocked my frugality, and groaned whenever I reminded them to be grateful. I thought it was just the arrogance of youth, something they would outgrow. But the years passed, and instead of gratitude, I saw entitlement. Instead of respect, I saw disdain. They wanted more better clothes, better cars. Holidays are broadened, though I stretched myself thin to provide. It was never enough. The more I gave, the less they seemed to see me. I still remember one night, vividly. It was Margaret's 16th birthday. I had saved for months to buy her a necklace she had admired in a shop window. It wasn't extravagant, but it was real silver, delicate and beautiful. When I handed it to her, her smile faltered. She turned it over in her hands and said, "It's fine, Dad, but Sarah's parents bought her a gold one, with diamonds." The words pierced me more sharply than any battlefield wound. I had given her all I could, and it wasn't enough. Elizabeth tried to comfort me, always the peacemaker. She reminded me that children don't always understand sacrifice until they're older. But deep down, a fear grew in me that they would never see, never understand. Still, I pressed on. When Elizabeth fell ill, I was by her side through every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night. She passed far too soon, leaving me with a hollow ache that never truly healed. I thought my children would rally around me then, that grief would draw us closer. Instead, I found myself more alone than ever. They were busy, they said, busy with their careers, their families, their lives. I do not tell you this to seek pity. I tell you because it is the truth. I built my life on sacrifice, on love, on devotion to my family. I gave everything I had, believing that one day it would be returned, not in riches, not in material things, but in love, respect, companionship. But as I grew older, I began to see the harsh reality. Sometimes, the more you give, the less people value it. My children did not see me as the man who had carried them on his shoulders, who had worked himself ragged to put food on their plates. They saw me as an obligation, a burden, an old man clinging to relevance. And that realization, that is where the seeds of the will were planted. But I will come to that later. For now, You must understand the life I lived, the love I gave, and the sacrifices I made. Only then can you truly see why, on that fateful day in the lawyer's office, I chose the path I did. Because my story is not about revenge. It is about dignity. And dignity, my friend, is the last gift I could give myself when love was no longer returned. You already know the man I was, the boy who grew up with nothing, the father who gave everything. But what you don't yet know is how slowly, painfully, I began to realize that all my sacrifices had bought me not love, but indifference. The disrespect didn't come all at once. It crept in like a draft through the cracks of a door settle at first, almost unnoticeable, until one day the cold was all around me. When Elizabeth passed, I thought my children would draw nearer. Death has a way of reminding us what truly matters, doesn't it? At least, that's what I believed. I imagined Sunday dinners where they would bring their families, conversations by the fire where we would remember their mother together, laughter filling the rooms that now echoed with silence. Instead, what followed was absence. At first, there were excuses: work, commitments, children's schedules, long drives. Next weekend, Dad, I promise. But next weekend rarely came. Weeks turned into months, and I found myself sitting at the kitchen table alone, staring at two empty chairs where once Elizabeth and I had shared our lives. Robert, my eldest, was the first to show me the sharp edge of disregard. He had grown successful in business, proud of the house he owned, the cars in his drive, the tailored suits that hung from his shoulders. I went to visit him once, after Elizabeth's funeral, hoping for comfort, maybe even just conversation. His wife greeted me at the door with a forced smile, her eyes already scanning the watch on her wrist. We sat in the living room, though it felt more like a showroom, everything gleaming, everything expensive. I tried to tell Robert about the loneliness, how the nights stretched longer without his mother's voice. He nodded, but his eyes kept flicking to his phone. When his wife entered the room with a tray of tea, I heard her whisper, "Perhaps not," as quietly as she thought. "He'll be here all evening if you don't say something." Robert cleared his throat and said, "Dad, maybe it's best if you call before coming by. We've got such a busy schedule, and the kids, well, they don't really know how to handle long visits." I sat there with the teacup trembling in my hands. Busy, always busy. Too busy for the man who had worked himself into exhaustion so they would never know hunger. Margaret was a little different. She had become a writer, a successful one at that. Her home was filled with bookshelves, her name printed on spines that lined the walls. I was proud. How could I not be? I attended one of her book launches once, sitting quietly at the back while she spoke on stage about her inspirations. She mentioned professors, friends, even a childhood teacher. But my name, not once. Later, when I congratulated her, she smiled politely, almost as though I were a stranger. "Dad," she said, adjusting her necklace, the same one I had bought her when she was 16. Though I doubt she remembered. "You really shouldn't come to these events without telling me first. It can be distracting." Distracting, that's what I was to her. And then there was Daniel, my youngest. Of all of them, he had been the closest to me when he was little. He would sit in the garage with me, handing me tools while I fixed old engines, asking questions about how things worked. His eyes had once lit up when I explained the world to him. But somewhere along the way, that light dimmed. When I visited him at university, he seemed embarrassed to introduce me to his friends. My clothes were too plain, my hands too calloused, my speech too old-fashioned. He avoided eye contact, hurried me out of sight, as though ashamed of the man who had raised him. But perhaps the deepest cuts were not in the words spoken, but in the silences. The phone that did not ring, the birthday cards that never arrived, the empty seats at Christmas. One Christmas, I prepared the house the way Elizabeth always had. I decorated the tree with ornaments we had collected over decades. I cooked her favorite dishes: roast lamb, Yorkshire pudding, mince pies. I set the table for 5, imagining the laughter of my children, the clinking of glasses, the warmth of family. They never came. Hours passed, the food grew cold, and finally a text buzzed on my phone. It was from Robert. "Sorry, Dad. Something came up. We'll try next week. No explanation. No apology that carried weight. Just empty words on a glowing screen. I sat at that table, staring at the feast meant for family, and I felt the loneliest I had ever felt in my life. Over time, the comments grew sharper. One evening, when I managed to visit Margaret, I overheard her telling her husband, "He eats so much, and he never brings anything. It's like having another child in the house." I ate so much. My pension was modest, yes, but I had always offered to bring groceries, to cook, to help in any way I could. To hear her reduce me to a burden, after all I had given, felt like being stabbed in the chest. There were other moments, too small humiliations that piled up like bricks in a wall. Robert rolling his eyes when I told an old story, muttering, "We've heard this 100 times." Margaret sighing heavily when I asked about her work, as if my curiosity was an inconvenience. Daniel ignoring my calls for weeks, then finally answering with a distracted, "What is it, Dad? I'm busy." Each moment chipped away at the image I had held of us as a family. But the worst came the day Robert told me outright, "Dad, maybe you should think about selling your house and moving into assisted living. It's too much for you to handle. Besides, the house is far too big for one person." I knew what he meant. He didn't see a home filled with memories, with laughter and tears etched into the walls. He saw property, value, something to be inherited, not cherished. I looked him in the eyes that day and realized he no longer saw me as his father. To him, I was an obstacle between him and the wealth he believed was his by right. That was the moment the scales began to tip. For years, I had told myself they were just busy, just distracted, that deep down they loved me. But love does not dismiss. Love does not humiliate. Love does not forget. And so, piece by piece, my hope crumbled. I had lived my life believing that sacrifice would be rewarded with respect, that love given would return in kind. But the truth became clearer with every cold glance, every unreturned call, every seat left empty at my table. My children did not value me. They valued what I had. And that realization, that bitter truth, was the beginning of my resolve. Because no man, no father, no human being deserves to spend his final years begging for scraps of affection from those who should give it freely. I had not yet reached my breaking point. That would come later. But by then, the fire had been lit. There comes a moment in every man's life when he realizes he has been pushed as far as he can go. For me, that moment did not come suddenly, like a thunderclap. It crept up slowly, the way dusk falls over a quiet village until I was swallowed in darkness before I even realized the light was gone. But there was one night, one humiliating night, that sealed my fate and turned my heart cold. It began on an ordinary evening. I had gone to visit Robert, my eldest, after he invited me, though I suspect it was more his wife's insistence than his own. They had recently redecorated their home, and she wanted to show it off. I wore my best suit, one Elizabeth had sewn years before, now a little faded but still neat. I polished my shoes until they gleamed, combed my thinning hair carefully, and even brought a bottle of wine I could barely afford. When I arrived, the warmth of welcome was absent. Robert opened the door with a stiff smile, his eyes darting past me to check if neighbors were watching. His wife stood behind him, her arms crossed, her gaze already dripping with disapproval. "Dad," Robert said, his voice flat, "come in." The house was immaculate, every surface gleaming, every piece of furniture modern and expensive. It felt less like a home and more like a showroom for wealth. As I stepped inside, I could almost feel my presence disturbing the perfection. Dinner was served, though I noticed there was barely enough food for me. Small portions, carefully measured, as if they worried I might eat too much. I remembered Margaret's cruel words about me being another child in the house, and wondered if Robert's wife shared the same sentiment. The conversation was shallow. They asked nothing about my life, my health, or how I spent my days. Instead, they spoke about holidays abroad, investments, promotions. I nodded, smiled politely, though each word felt like a reminder that I no longer belonged in their world. Then came the moment that shattered me. After dinner, I offered to help clear the table. Robert's wife gave a tight smile and said, "That won't be necessary. Why don't you sit in the living room?" I obeyed, cane in hand, shuffling to their pristine sofa. I sat there alone, listening to the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. After a while, Robert returned, his face stern. "Dad," he began, clearing his throat, "we need to talk." I looked up, my heart tightening. Something in his tone told me this would not be a conversation of love. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke the words that pierced me deeper than any knife. "Maybe it's best if you don't stay here overnight anymore. It's just, with the kids, with Sarah, it's becoming too much. We've been thinking it might be better if, when you visit, you sleep in the garage. It's spacious, you know, and we can set up a cot. That way, you'll have your own space." My own space. The garage. I stared at him, struggling to understand if I had heard correctly. The garage where he parked his car, where tools and boxes were piled high, where cold drafts seeped through the cracks. That was where my son believed I belonged. Not in the home I had helped him build, not under the roof where laughter should echo, but in a cold, concrete box meant for storage. I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came. My throat tightened. My chest ached. I felt as though the floor had fallen from beneath me. In that moment, I remembered the nights when Robert was a boy, how he had crawled into my bed during storms, trembling with fear. I had held him close, whispering that he was safe, that his father would never let harm come to him. And now, decades later, that same boy now, a man was pointing me to a garage, as if I were no better than an old coat tossed aside. I forced a smile, though tears burned behind my eyes. "Of course," I whispered, "if that's easier for everyone." That night, I lay on the thin cot they had placed in the garage, clutching the blanket I had brought with me. The concrete floor was cold beneath me, the air damp and unwelcoming. Through the thin walls, I could hear muffled laughter from inside, the house my family's laughter, from which I had been excluded. I cried silently, my shoulders shaking, careful not to make a sound. A grown man, a father, reduced to tears in the dark. But they were not tears of weakness. They were tears of grief, of betrayal, of a love that had been crushed under the weight of greed and indifference. That night was my breaking point. The humiliation carved something permanent into my heart. I realized then that my children no longer saw me as a father, but as an obligation, a nuisance to be hidden away. They did not value my presence, only what I could leave behind when I was gone. The next morning, when I left Robert's house, I did not say a word. I walked slowly down the drive, cane tapping against the pavement, the cool air biting at my skin. Behind me, the house stood tall and perfect, gleaming like a monument to everything they valued: status, wealth, appearances. Inside that house, my son lived comfortably, and yet he had placed his father in the garage. From that day forward, something inside me changed. I stopped expecting their visits, stopped hoping for phone calls. I no longer set the table for 5 at Christmas. I no longer bought gifts for birthdays that were never acknowledged. My heart, once open and generous, began to close, but I was not bitter. No bitterness is for those who still crave what they cannot have. I had moved past craving their affection. What remained was resolve. I would no longer beg for scraps of love. I would no longer lower myself to earn respect that should have been given freely. If my children could not see my worth in life, then they would learn of it in death. And so, in the quiet solitude of my home, I began to prepare. I contacted my lawyer. I rewrote my will. Each word I dictated felt like reclaiming a piece of dignity that had been stripped from me. They thought they had broken me by pushing me into a garage, but in truth, they had awakened the strength I had forgotten I possessed. That night of humiliation was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The breaking point. The moment I chose to stop being the man who endlessly gave and to become the man who finally took back control. I have always believed that life has a strange way of balancing itself out. Sometimes it takes decades, sometimes a single night. For me, justice came not in anger, not in loud confrontations, but in silence, in patience. and in the form of a carefully written document, locked away in my desk drawer, my will. After that night in Robert's garage, I carried a scar no one could see. Outwardly, I still greeted my children when they called, still attended the rare birthdays and gatherings to which I was invited, still smiled politely when they spoke of their successes. But deep inside, I had closed a door. I had stopped expecting love, stopped begging for attention, and most importantly, I had stopped allowing their cruelty to define my worth. Instead, I turned my pain into preparation. One cold January morning, I visited a solicitor in Leeds, a kind man, gray-haired and patient, who listened as I told him how I wanted my affairs arranged. I remember the way his eyebrows rose slightly when I explained my intentions. He had likely heard thousands of family stories, yet mine must have struck him differently. "You're certain about this?" he asked, his pen hovering above the paper. "More certain than I've ever been of anything," I replied. We spent hours drafting every clause, every sentence. I was meticulous. I knew my children, if there was any loophole, they would try to exploit it. When it was done, the document lay before me like a shield, protecting me from beyond the grave. I signed it with a steady hand, feeling stronger than I had in years. What they didn't know and what shocked them later was that I was not a poor, helpless old man as they believed. For decades, I had lived modestly, saving carefully, investing quietly. I had inherited a small property from my father, sold it at the right time, and reinvested the money wisely. Over the years, those investments grew, slowly but surely, until they amounted to more than any of my children had ever earned. To them, I was just dad, the burden, the old man eating too much food, sitting too long in their houses, taking up space. They never once asked about my life, about what I had built, about what I might leave behind. They thought I had nothing, but I had everything. They valued money, property, assets, and so I made my choice. I did not cut them out entirely. No, that would have been too easy for them to dismiss as spite. Instead, I left them small amounts tokens, really, just enough to remind them they were my children, but not enough to satisfy their greed. The bulk of my estate, the true weight of my life's work, I left elsewhere. Some went to charity, two causes Elizabeth and I had always cared about: hospices, children's homes, scholarships for students who came from nothing, as I once had, and the rest, the largest share, went to someone who had shown me kindness when my own blood had not. Her name was Clara, my neighbor, a widowed woman who lived across the street, who often brought me warm meals when she saw me sitting alone. She would check on me after storms, invite me to tea, and treat me not as a burden, but as a human being worthy of dignity. She was not family by blood, but by heart. And I decided it was better to reward genuine love than inherited entitlement. Years passed. My children continued their lives, barely noticing my quiet withdrawal. Visits grew fewer, phone calls shorter, excuses more frequent. I knew my time was drawing near, and strangely, I felt peace. And then, the day came. I passed, on a calm spring morning, the kind where the sun filters gently through the curtains, and the birds sing without hurry. There was no drama, no pain, just a quiet exhale, as if my body had decided it had carried enough. I imagined the shock on my children's faces when the solicitor summoned them for the reading of my will. They must have expected to inherit everything, must have whispered to each other about houses, bank accounts, cars. Perhaps they even began to spend the money in their minds before hearing a single word. The room was heavy with anticipation that day. Robert sat stiffly, his wife beside him, her eyes gleaming with greed. Margaret was there too, looking annoyed, as though the entire process was a waste of her time. My youngest, Thomas, who had barely spoken to me in years, leaned back in his chair with a smug smile, as if the fortune was already his. Then the solicitor began to read the small tokens. First, Robert received my watch, the one he had admired as a boy. Margaret, a framed photo of her mother and me on our wedding day. Thomas, a small sum of money, enough to cover a year's worth of rent, no more. I can almost hear their confusion. I can picture the way their smiles faltered, their bodies stiffening, as the solicitor cleared his throat and moved on to the larger parts of the will. To charity, he read a donation of £2 million to be distributed among the following organizations. I imagine Robert's knuckles whitening, Margaret's lips pressing into a thin line, Thomas shifting uncomfortably in his chair, and finally, the solicitor said, the remainder of the estate, including property, investments, and savings, shall be inherited by Mrs. Clara Whitfield, my neighbor and dear friend, who showed me more love and kindness in my final years than my own children ever did. The silence that must have filled that room, heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the rustle of papers and the shallow breaths of my children, realizing they had been outloved, outvalued, outdone by a woman who owed me nothing but gave me everything. That was my justice. Not loud, not vengeful, but poetic. They had placed me in a garage. I had placed them in the shadows of their own greed. They had seen me as worthless, and in the end, they were the ones left with scraps. While a woman of kindness inherited the life they believed was theirs by right, I did not leave my will to punish them, though they will likely see it that way. I left it as a mirror, so they might finally see themselves clearly. Perhaps, in that moment of shock, they understood what they had done. Perhaps not, but for me, the victory was not in their faces of disbelief. The victory was in knowing that I had chosen love over obligation, kindness over cruelty, and dignity over humiliation. That, my friends, was the twist of fate. When people hear the story of my will, they often imagine bitterness guided my hand, that I left my fortune to strangers and charities out of spite, to punish my children for the way they treated me. But I tell you this, from the depths of my heart, spite had nothing to do with it. My decision came not from anger, but from clarity. Age has a way of stripping away illusions. When you stand closer to the end than the beginning, you begin to see what truly matters, what has weight and what is merely dust. I spent so many years clinging to the illusion that family meant loyalty, love, and respect simply because of blood. But blood alone is not enough. Love must be chosen, nurtured, proven. My children never chose me. They inherited me. And to them, inheritance meant burden. But Clara, my neighbor, my friend, she chose me every single day. She chose to knock on my door when no one else did. She chose to bring me soup when I was ill, to laugh at my old stories, to treat me not as a relic but as a man with dignity. She had no obligation, no duty, no promise of reward. Her kindness was pure, and that is why she deserved my trust, my gratitude, and yes, my inheritance. I know some will call me cruel. They will say I abandoned my children in death as they abandoned me in life. But I see it differently. What I left them was more valuable than money. I left them a lesson. When the solicitor's words fell into that heavy silence, when my children's faces twisted from confidence to disbelief, I imagined the mirror I placed before them finally revealed their true reflection. They saw greed. They saw indifference. They saw the cost of neglect. Perhaps, in that moment, their shame was heavier than any fortune they could have inherited. And if that shame sparks even the smallest flicker of change in their hearts, then my decision will have been worth it. But let me be honest, I do not place my hope in them anymore. I no longer live for the possibility that they may someday regret or repent. My time on this earth taught me that you cannot force love where it does not exist. You cannot beg respect from those who refuse to give it. My peace comes not from what they may learn, but from what I learned. I learned that family is not bound by blood. Family is forged in kindness, in loyalty, in presence. A neighbor can be family. A nurse who holds your hand in the hospital can be family. A friend who remembers your birthday when your children forget, it's family. I learned that dignity is not given, it is claimed. For too long, I allowed myself to be treated as less than I was. I accepted their coldness, their dismissal, their cruel words. I thought enduring it quietly was strength. But true strength came the moment I decided I deserved better. True strength came when I stopped lowering my worth to match their blindness, And I learned that legacy is not about wealth. Legacy is about the impact you leave behind, the ripples that spread after you are gone. My legacy is not in the money I left, though it will help others. My legacy is in the lesson I carved into the hearts of my children, whether they accept it or not, that love cannot be faked, and that those who sow cruelty will not reap comfort. When I imagine the years to come, I picture Clara continuing to live in peace, perhaps helping others as she helped me. I picture scholarships giving young students a chance to rise where I once struggled. I picture charities easing the suffering of those forgotten by society. That, to me, is wealth well spent. That is wealth turned into meaning. And when it comes to my children, I hope they remember not the inheritance they lost, but the father they lost long before. Perhaps they will recall the nights I stayed awake, tending to their fevers. The Christmas mornings when I worked extra shifts so they could open presents. The countless sacrifices Elizabeth and I made so they could dream bigger than we ever dared. Perhaps those memories will whisper to them louder than any solicitor's reading. But whether they remember or not, I am free. I leave this world not with bitterness, but with peace. I am at peace because I finally understood that I was never worthless, never a burden, never undeserving of love. The way they treated me reflected their hearts, not my worth. I carried that truth into my final breath, and it made the weight of all those years lighter. So, if you are listening to my story, I ask you this: do not wait until your final years to claim your dignity. Do not wait until your death to demand respect. And above all, do not believe that blood is the only thread that weaves family together. Cherish those who cherish you, no matter who they are. Because in the end, when the last breath leaves your chest and your story is complete, it will not matter who shared your surname. What will matter is who shared your heart. Sometimes, blood is not family. True family are the ones who stand beside you when the world turns its back. That is the lesson of my life. That is the legacy I leave behind. And though my children may be shocked, though they may call me cruel, I know this: I chose love over obligation, truth over pretense, dignity over humiliation. And in that choice, I found